underlying frameworks of regulations, ethical and societal.
Hi, good afternoon, ladies and gents. My name's Gavin Brown. I'm here as a moderator at the kind invitation of AIBC Europe. So very pleased today to be talking about all things regulation and in the sort of fintech space across many different areas of technology. I'm very kindly joined by two expert panelists as well. So I'm going to just hand to them in turn to introduce themselves. So Andre, would you like to lead off first?
Sure, thanks. Andre Schwer from the University of Malta. I'm a physicist by training, and in fact, I'm the head of physics over here. But apart from that, I'm interested a lot in sort of the ethics around technology and whether we should regulate or shouldn't regulate it. Also because my wife's a lawyer, so we have interesting discussions about that. And I'm really glad to be part of this panel.
Excellent, lovely to meet you, Andre. And Jaguar, are you able to just give us an introduction about yourself and your professional background as well, please?
Thank you. I'm JAGUAR-ADVA. I'm the CEO of Jaguar Lawyers, and my office is my firm does regulation and regulatory consulting and compliance consultation, as well as licensing for crypto companies, blockchain, and fintech in general. I'm part of the leading committee of the Fintech Israel Association here, part of Fintech Ladies, and it's what I like to do.
Excellent. Lovely to meet you both, albeit digitally in these times of COVID. So let's progress. As I said, my name is Gavin. I'm an associate professor at the University of Liverpool, and I tend to research and write on cryptocurrency and the adoption of potential crypto and blockchain technologies. Okay, so first question, Andre, to you. I mean, maybe let's kick off. You mentioned there that you were very interested in sort of the role of governments and regulators, and I think we used the phrase in some of the conversations we had together in the sort of pre-chat and research to this panel, the idea of regulating the unregulatable, the idea of that some of these technologies are deliberately designed in such a way that makes them difficult to control, and that's part of their appeal in some way. So what kind of role do you think a regulator can have, and what sort of some of the key challenges you think they face in trying to deal with these types of technologies?
It's a very good point, and in fact, one of the biggest challenges, as far as I can make out, in many of these technologies, one can see it both in cryptocurrencies, also in my other life. If you're talking about, for example, quantum communications, which are unbreakable, quantum computers, which are also super fast and they can break into encryption. There's similar challenges which run through both. One can think about the role of the regulator there being kind of shielding the consumer in some sense, trying to find out ways in which, well, not to regulate as such, but at least increase awareness, at least make sure that people know what they're getting into. So, do your own research, but at least with some help from someone who can do research at a deeper level and understands the tech a bit better than the retail consumer, for example.
Yeah, I think there's some great points there. I know it's, I once listened to a very good talk in Manchester, and there was a chap talking about, he drew the parallels between sort of crypto and regulation and fintech regulation broadly. And he mentioned about radio and the history of radio and the idea that it was quite difficult to regulate, and how the technology actually tends to go ahead of the regulation. And then it's the job of the regulator to kind of catch up, keep the good bits and protect us from the bad bits, but always through the rearview mirror rather than kind of looking forward, which the rest of us in the space tend to do. Jaguar, obviously you deal with this on a day-to-day basis, often from the client side. And I just wondered what kind of insights you have from your side in terms of how you feel regulation in fintech is going broadly at the moment.
Well, I can remind us all the famous called the California Act called the Red Flag Act. The one that was meant for the new cars, and basically you should have had a person running about 60 yards in front of a car because it was supposed to be like a motorized horse. And then there was a correction to that law very recently, and I think it was 1976 or something, that there was a great progress on that. The red flag, the person holding a red flag in front of the car did not have to go about 60 yards ahead, but only 20 yards ahead. And that gives us a great example. Yes, it's very funny. It gives us a great example of how much faster technology is compared to regulators. And the poor guys, they're really trying there, but there's no chance anyone dealing with law, tell your wife to excuse me, please, there. But still, the law professionals and specifically the regulators in that profession, we can't be as fast as the technologists. So what we can do is try to make minimum damage to customers, and speaking about what we present to them, and avoiding AMLs and avoiding deceiving, etc. But we will not ever be able to be as fast as technology.
And do you think, Joe? I mean, that's excellent insight you got there. And I really like the red flag example you gave, which I've not heard of that before. But I just wonder. Obviously, the argument which I think we're all agreed on is this notion of technology naturally tends to move faster, and it's almost an impossible task to keep pace. But do you think that regulators more broadly are creative enough in their solutions? I'm just thinking there that by that they still use the same test, that red flag test, as the one you described, albeit at a shorter distance. They were still using the outdated methodology, arguably. And I just wonder, do you think that? I mean, I know here in the UK, regulators argue till the cows come home about, even from a crypto perspective, what's the correct terminology to use, and that's only the very first step on a very long road of dealing with these things. And I just wondered, to what extent do you think regulators perhaps need to be more creative and original in terms of not necessarily tearing up the rule book, but certainly being more imaginative in how it evolves with that technology?
Well, I think regulators take an example of what they know so far. Take another bad example, I could say, that was used to judge ICOs, which is the Howie test. Howie test is based on an orchard, which was back in in the United States in the old days. And basically, they have to use an analogy to what has been before. Take into account the precedents that we use. As a precedent from one case to another, we can only judge a case by what has happened so far. And that's not very relevant in technology, because the whole point, specifically in blockchain industry and in fintech as well, is trying to create a new existence or new reality. So to answer your question, if we're using the logic based on analogy of how like it is to what we had before, there's no way it could work. So the only thing we could do is regulators can do is get as close as they can, and they can't really break new realms or break new skies in that.
I'm pleased you mentioned the Howie example there. I always remember when the SEC launched their Howie coin as that honeypot trap as a false ICO, which the website is still open now. I always use it as a test case with my students just to see their red flag test again. And that's great. And Andre, obviously turning to you now, just thinking a bit more holistically around the roles of regulation in society in particular. Do you think I'm looking at the test case or something that happened recently in the UK. The FCA regulator there ruled against derivative products, in terms of crypto derivative products being marketed, promoted and sold to retail investors. And a lot of arguments were made at the time that there seems to be an unequitable treatment in the realms of fintech broadly, and in particular crypto, in terms of how regulators deal with these types of new products. Do you feel that regulators are perhaps overly conservative, or do you think sort of we the people need that protection, and therefore they're very prudent to do so?
I'm divided. So on the one hand, I mean, as you can see from several ICOs, I mean, people do occasionally need a bit of hand-holding. On the other hand, there are very, very risky traditional investment opportunities which are open to people. So at the end of the day, I mean, one could always, as long as there's a good enough label, and as long as people understand the consequences of that, then I would argue that hand-holding is good, but not blocking, so to speak. And I think perhaps this is the dance that regulators are playing. The other way I see things, and of course this comes from, again, my other life as based in physical reality, is the notion of sandboxes and test beds. And it's true, regulators in general can only look ahead because they analogize, as Jaguar is saying. So why not to kind of have a safe space where things can kind of be not quite the Wild West, but halfway there, and attempt, you just use that as an experiment, see how things evolve, and then see what needs to be stopped, what needs to be regulated. So that allows them perhaps to see things as they could be before kind of pulling back and really drawing up what the rules are. rather than relying on analogies which are flawed, as the red flag test, which I didn't know either, shows us.
I like the as you say there, just the sandboxes seem to be very much the norm now, don't they? I know when the FCA sandbox comes out, I'm always very interested in the latest cohort, reading about the different business models, new technologies coming through, and that probably leads me on quite nicely, and to turn to you now, Jaguar, if you don't mind as well. Obviously, when we're thinking about fintech and positive regulatory environments, the likes of Switzerland, Malta, those sort of typical candidate countries as being extremely amiable to the tech and very pro the tech, albeit in still in a robust way. What's your feeling of the global landscape at the moment? Are there any jurisdictions that are perhaps people have not really heard of so much, and 5 to 10 years out may become much bigger in the fintech space as you see it?
Well, first of all, for payment solutions companies, I have to mention Cyprus, as it's been a location in which many payment solution companies are being based there, not just for tax reasons, or because it's not that much of a tax haven, but mainly thanks to very relatively liberal regulations. So that's one point. It's a small country, but still, it's very significant in its financial and fintech companies. So that's one to mention. Gibraltar is a very known candidate for that. It still does have very liberal regulations. And I must say that, unfortunately, Singapore is losing its leadership, I would say, because of the recent, about a year and a half, strengthening of their regulations. So, and of course, we have Lithuania and Estonia, which are more, I would say, easier on licensing and easier on compliance, on making sure companies are complying with their regulations. So it's not that only the regulation part of it, it's also the length at which, or the strength at which compliance is applied, I would say.
I really like the fact you mentioned the Estonian example there. I was doing some research the other day on blockchain voting solutions, and obviously with Estonia, with their e-governance and digital identities and all the ways they manage your data across their different governance services and public sector solutions is really a benchmark for many countries globally, I think there. So it's a great example. And turning to you, Andre, I mean, speaking perhaps about countries in particular, or maybe even projects that you're interested in or researching at the moment, is there anything you'd be able to share with us of anything that you're particularly focused on of late, or maybe going forward?
So I'm involved in the country's digital economy think tank. So I'm going to mention one of those, one of the ideas we're looking at there, and it's basically kind of emulating best practices like Estonia when it comes to sort of sharing information within and outside the public sector. Not necessarily for voting, but land registries and things like that. So we're thinking about how to expand and do things perhaps better than the current best practices. On the other side of things, in my quantum life, we're also kind of looking at using the country as a test bed for new technologies now on the physical level. So that's where being small helps, because you can roll out things. I want to say cheaply, if you know what I mean. But you can do things quickly, or break. I can't remember the Facebook motto, but go fast and break things, or something like that. So you can do things in that framework in smaller countries, smaller jurisdictions, and that's really helping us in both digital and physical sectors. So those are two examples I would bring up.
Excellent, thank you for that. They sound very interesting. And Jaguar, turning to you now as well, any particular projects you'd be able to share with us in the regulatory and legal space?
Yes, and surprisingly, it would be in Singapore. There's one that I happen to be on the board of advisors there. Is I'd say an specific exchange for crypto, which is fully regulated, and it was established initially as a regulated one, not usually as it is that the exchanges come up non-regulated first, and then they try to work themselves up the regulation phase, I would say. So one of them is Fortune 1. It's based in Singapore, and it is led by one of the investors, which is called the Bitcoin Man, and that's one initiative. Second would be there would be actually several fintech-related payment solution companies that are arising from Israel. which is where I'm based off, so I would know more about them. So this would be the more interesting one, because these organizations understand that you cannot try to maneuver regulators and go behind that. They're aware that it will come to you anyway, the compliance and the enforcement of regulations. So they start to be fully regulated in advance from scratch.
Oh, I'm with you. So in terms of they almost set the hurdle higher than it needs to be in order to get ahead of where the hurdle will eventually become, kind of thing.
Right. Yes, indeed.
Excellent. And just thinking, I mean, I'll come back to you now, Andre, if you don't mind. Thinking more broadly, because obviously from the regulators' perspective, so thinking about regulation and legal frameworks more broadly, one of the key challenges we've got here is that much of this technology tends to exist at kind of a meta level. Gone are the days of a nice head office and a tax domicile and an accounting domicile with a listing, and you could go and knock on the door. Now we're in a world of decentralized finance becoming very much to the fore, decentralized exchanges coming through. Obviously, DLT technology is running through many of the types of payment solutions, not just obviously Bitcoin, but many other types of blockchain-oriented solutions as well. And I just wondered, to what extent do you feel that regulators and legal systems and frameworks are going to have to work together in order to come up with a common standard to try and control and allow human beings to take the best of this technology and mitigate against the worst? Do you think that that's a fair argument, or do you see things working differently?
No, I think it's a fair argument. I'm not sure how and when that's going to happen, but I think it helps both sides to have some level of regulation. And my argument for that is, unless you have regulation, what tends to happen is that some customers, or the majority of customers, will end up entering into things that they are used to certain amounts of protections, and those things that they enter into will not have the same protections, and that kind of overshadows the technology itself. So we've seen that a lot with ICOs, for example, where they got a bad reputation, justified or not, but they did get a bad reputation. And my argument there is, if people set the bar slightly higher, as you were saying, and as Jaguar was saying, set the bar slightly higher, then what will end up happening is that the technology is not overshadowed by these implications, and things will actually go do better. So I think they will, but I don't know how.
Yeah, that's always the tough one, isn't it? The how bit. Excellent. Well, as we move into the final couple of minutes of the panel, I just wonder if maybe we could distill down perhaps one thing that you would be keen to that's certainly on your radar, one thing that's potentially should be something that the listeners and viewers should be looking out for in terms of changes or events that are forthcoming in the regulation and legal framework space. So Jaguar, I'll start with you if that's okay. What would be the one thing you're looking out for at the moment in terms of technologies on the horizon or a key event?
I could say one thing, that since in the last 12 months or so, we've seen a lot of the central banks coming out with their CBDCs, their digital currency, potentially digital currencies, after the regulators or the Senate has kind of killed, I would say, Facebook's initiative with Libra. And I remember David Marcus saying in a Senate hearing that something like, you guys, we need to be aware, because if we are not going to be the one doing this first, China will be. So, and that's actually happening exactly as he was saying. So I will see now that when the CBDCs come out and progress much more, regulators are going to be much more friendly with those initiatives. And then they'll have to explain how come they are so friendly with CBDCs initiatives and not as friendly as they were with private initiatives of private companies. So I think this will progress the acceptance much faster than we ever thought. So that's what I'm looking for in the next year.
Thanks, Jaguar. And very, very quickly, Andre, just in a couple of words, what would be yours? Just time is almost out now.
I actually wrote down central bank digital currency, so I was going to say the same thing. To be fair, it is one of the most exciting, broadly and interesting things to be watching out for. So no, I'm just going to say the same thing. So CBDCs are probably the thing to watch out for.
Thanks ever so much, both. I think for me as well, I'd say CBDCs too, and I guess as part of that identity management, things like ERC 725. Identity protocols, digital identity. So thanks very much. It's been a wonderful pleasure to meet you both digitally Andre, Jaguar as well. It's been a pleasure. Take care. I'll speak to you back soon.
Yes, likewise. All right.
Thank you.